All right, we'll go ahead and get started, everyone. Welcome. Thank you all for joining us. My name is Sue Huang. I'm the head of data strategy at Datavant, and I'll be your moderator for today's webinar. Today, we have guests from Quest Diagnostics joining us to discuss how their data can be used to obtain clinical insights across a range of disease areas, including COVID-19. Patrick Winowitz is a Senior Director of Information Ventures, and Dr. Harvey Kaufman is Senior Medical Director at Quest. We will first cover an overview of Quest Diagnostics and the breadth of their data, highlight examples of how this data can be used, and focus especially on the COVID-19 insights coming out of the analysis of Quest data. If you have questions, you can submit them by clicking the icon at the bottom right of your Zoom window labeled Q&A. We will answer select questions live at the end of this presentation, time permitting. Patrick and Dr. Kaufman, thanks so much for joining us. Can you please take a moment to tell us a bit more about your background and responsibilities at Quest?
Yeah, thank you, Sue. I'm happy to be here today to talk about the data and informatics solutions from Quest Diagnostics. Dr. Kaufman and I are part of a group within Quest Diagnostics called Information Ventures. Our group is responsible for creating solutions derived from the Quest data assets. And we do that across 4 different markets. And those markets are health plans, health systems, clinical trials, where we focus on identifying patients, sites, and investigators for trials. And the 4th line of business is our pharma and public health group. And I lead that pharma and public health business. I've been at Quest for about 9 years and held a variety of roles, both in our IT organization and the Quest EHR business. Before joining Quest, I spent 15 years with a large EHR provider, working primarily in the ambulatory and home health and hospice space. Dr. Kaufman, I'll turn it over to you for introductions.
Thank you, Sue, and thank you, Patrick. I'm a pathologist, and I serve as Senior Medical Director for Medical Informatics in the Office of the Chief Medical Officer. I've served in a great number of roles in my 28-plus years at Quest Diagnostics, including as its first Chief Laboratory Officer. And I've led the Quest Diagnostics Health Trends team since inception, where we report on important public health insights.
Thanks for those introductions. The first part of our webinar will be an overview of the Quest Diagnostics business and Quest's extensive test menu. Before we dive into that, I'd like to take a quick poll of the audience today to get an understanding of how many attendees are already using lab data in your research and analytic projects. Can you please take a moment to answer the poll? We'll give everyone a couple seconds to respond and we'll all see the results live. Great, awesome. Looks like the results are in. We have a lot of people who are familiar with lab data and also some who aren't but plan to use it in the near future. Thanks, everyone. So let's dive into an overview of Quest Diagnostics. Patrick, I'll turn it over to you now.
Great, thanks, Sue. So as the largest diagnostics laboratory in the country, you've undoubtedly heard of Quest Diagnostics and perhaps even had testing performed in one of our laboratories around the country. As a result of all of that testing that we've performed over the years, we have an extensive set of diagnostic laboratory data that can deliver insights in the life science market, as well as the other markets that I've mentioned. The Quest Diagnostics data assets are derived, as I said, from that diagnostic testing that we've performed, and the asset includes over 10 years of longitudinal data and over 52 billion data points. We have about 140 million unique patient encounters, 140 million patient encounters each year, resulting in those 140 million encounters. My apologies. We do touch about 30% of American adults each year, and over a 5-year period, our reach is about 50% of American adults. We serve about 50% of the hospitals and physicians across the United States. And since lab testing can be driven by one's insurance carrier, I do want to call out and note that at Quest Diagnostics, we have access to over 90% of insured lives in the country. And another point that I'd like to call out is we do leverage our own data. And as Harvey mentioned, he leads one of those groups that leverage our data. And we publish over 100 peer-reviewed publications each year. The clinical data repository, as I mentioned, is derived from the testing that we do, and that testing occurs in the ambulatory space, hospital and health systems, as well as the wellness programs that we offer. All data meets HIPAA requirements for de-identification, and therefore it can include patient data elements like age and sex. We also capture diagnosis code on most test orders. And when thinking about the diagnosis code, one can consider a diagnosis code being on a particular order, or because we have that longitudinal tracking ability, we can actually search across that patient's entire history to see if that diagnosis code is present anywhere in their record. We capture basic payer categories, like commercial payer, Medicare, Medicare Advantage, Medicaid, Medicaid Advantage, etc. However, we don't capture the specific plan information. And then when we look at the physician data, we capture and can include the ordering provider information, the NPI data, and those data points can enable a variety of different use cases. One of the unique value propositions of the Quest data is the timeliness of availability. So results are added to our reporting database every single day. And that data that we have can be licensed for historical delivery or prospective delivery, with those updates and deliveries occurring quarterly, monthly, weekly, and in some cases daily. Just to give an example of that, if a patient has a more common test, a basic lab test like a CBC or cholesterol test, and if that's drawn on a Monday, that specimen gets transported and reaches our lab on a Monday evening. That result then is returned to the provider, generally by 8 a.m. on Tuesday morning, and then reaches our informatics reporting database the following day, so Wednesday. So that's a pretty quick and tight turnaround time from a test that was performed on Monday and then resulted in being available for analytics and reporting on a Wednesday. So that in itself enables quite a number of use cases, and is quite an important value prop, we think. Of course, for some of the testing that has a longer turnaround time, something like a culture or an esoteric test, it's going to take a little bit longer to reach our database. So if it takes 3 to 5 days for that culture to grow, that same process would happen. As soon as that result is delivered to the provider, there's usually about 1 day of turnaround before it hits our reporting database. So how do we enable that rapid turnaround testing, and how does that data get to our database? So Quest has a courier fleet of over 3,600 vehicles and a fleet of 23 aircraft that move specimens around the country every single day. And those specimens are then processed in one of our 23 full-service laboratories around the country, or the 270 regional and stat labs. We do have a broad nationwide patient and provider coverage. And of course, as you would expect, more of the testing volume comes from the higher population areas in the country. But we do perform services for all countries, or all counties, for all states in the country. Later, Dr. Kauffman's going to be talking about some of the insights derived from our COVID testing data, but as an example of the reach of Quest Diagnostics. For our COVID testing that was performed between March and July, that data came from 97% of the counties in the country, and those counties represent 99.9% of the US population. Within Quest, we also have a pretty extensive medical team, and our medical team includes over 600 medical professionals that are aligned by therapeutic areas. And we call those therapeutic areas clinical franchises. And our franchises include oncology, general health and wellness, infectious disease, neurology, PDM and toxicology, and women's health. Our team routinely engages with customers to help them take full advantage of the insights that lab data can bring to a project. That could be clarifying testing that's related to a particular condition, answering questions about a specific test, or consulting on the latest science. And we're always happy to assist. But that group of medical professionals aligned across those franchises can be brought to bear or engaged to help ensure that you're getting what you need from the lab data. The Quest data and analytics solutions can be, along with some of the other services from Quest, support a broad range of activities across the drug development continuum. The data and analytics solutions can be leveraged from preclinical use on the left-hand side of this arc, clinical trial recruitment activities, safety studies, sponsored testing programs, and through commercial planning and targeting. So a little bit more detail on that. If you follow the arc from the left to the right, use of the de-identified data can provide insights into disease prevalence and progression, comorbidity, population level insights. The Clinical Trials Connect solution, which I mentioned, focuses on leveraging the Quest data assets to identify patients, investigators, and sites that match study criteria. It's another use case. And a unique value proposition that we have here is that as a covered entity, Quest can contact patients directly to inform them of specific trials. And then as we go to the far right-hand side of the arc and think about commercial use cases, our extensive test coverage and high testing volume can surface providers that have patients that align with in-market therapies. So lab data has utility on its own or in combination with other data sets. We have a robust test compendium that includes over 4,000 different tests, and this spans routine testing through esoteric testing, genetic testing, anatomic pathology. And you can see on the screen just some of the categories and types of testing that we commonly receive requests for. Just a subset of what's available, but just wanted to surface here and show some examples for you. If we think about some of the specific areas, we process over 30 million oncology tests per year, and we continue to expand our portfolio of available tests. One of the ways that we do this is through acquisitions. Over the past few years, we've acquired several different laboratories. One of those several years ago that we acquired is Athena Diagnostics, which was the largest neurology lab in the country. And more recently, Cleveland Heart Lab and MedFusion joined the Quest family, bringing additional advanced cardiovascular testing and additional oncology testing volume to Quest and to the Quest data assets. And then most recently, Quest acquired a company called Blueprint Genetics. And Blueprint Genetics offers about 3,900 single gene tests. And we're working on a project to bring that data into our reporting database as well. So as I mentioned, the Quest data assets include more than 52 billion data points derived from over 10 years of nationwide testing. And from routine testing to the advanced esoteric and genetic testing, our data covers nearly all therapeutic areas and can be leveraged across the drug development continuum.
Great, thanks, Patrick.
Sure.
That was a great overview of Quest Diagnostics, your test menu, and your capabilities in supporting researchers and users of the data. So let's move into the section of the presentation now where we dive into some specific use cases for lab data and go deeper there. Lab data is unique in its timeliness. It's often the earliest signal of disease diagnosis or whether a patient is eligible for a specific therapeutic. We believe that lab data will become increasingly more valuable as we develop more precision-based therapeutics. Patrick, can you elaborate on some of the use cases that you encounter most frequently from clients for Quest Diagnostics Data?
Thanks, Sue. Yeah, I'm happy to talk more about those use cases. And so as we saw on the previous ARC slide, the use cases for lab data span the drug development continuum. There are a variety of ways that the lab data can be leveraged to derive insights and answer any number of questions. At a high level, some of the sample use cases that we see are commercial on the commercial side, commercial triggers and alerts to identify providers with patients that fit a defined criteria, right? So that's leveraging the data for launch planning or in-market therapies. Patient journey and real-world evidence studies, and using the data alone or combining that data with claims or prescription data to better understand treatment patterns and outcomes. Understanding disease prevalence and progression. And in fact, we've got a slide on a case study showing that. Another way the data can be leveraged is ordering patterns and test result trends, understanding which providers are ordering which tests or testing that's related to a certain therapy. And then I do want to take just a minute to mention a few cases where we would not authorize the data to be licensed. And the first one I think is fairly obvious. Of course, we're talking about de-identify data here. So any attempt to re-identify the data, or if the end goal was to try to gain more information about patients that in a way that would re-identify them, certainly we would not support that. We would not license data to anyone that's a direct competitor of ours. There does need to be a defined project and a specific use case for the data. Here at Quest Diagnostics, we don't generally license our data for broad, unrestricted use. It's generally, as I've said, for a specific project or specific use cases. And we generally would not license our data to be used in any commercialized solutions, something that we could potentially discuss, but generally that license of the data prohibits commercialization of the Quest data assets. And I'm going to talk a little bit more specifically about two use cases of the Quest data. And the first one I'm going to share and talk about is on the commercial side, and a project that we worked on to help a pharma company identify market expansion opportunities. So using a collaborative approach, the Quest team worked with the pharma customer to define goals and objectives for their project, right? So we had some dialogue to understand what they were trying to do. And what we learned from that is that they were trying to identify additional market opportunities. And so what we did as we worked through this process and understood their needs is we determined that there was a need to leverage the longitudinal data in our database and some specific lab results. They also then needed to segment those results by geography, by age groupings, and then there was also an interest in income levels. So after we identified those data types, we got to work on the analysis, really simplifying this process a bit, but we went through the analysis and developed a report for the customer. And the next slide shows a portion of the outcome of that analysis that was performed. And you'll see here on the chart that what was derived from the data and insights that were surfaced was that persons living in lower median income areas had higher HCV positivity rates compared to persons living in higher medium income areas. And the positivity patterns across those income levels, with baby boomers being the highest, having the highest HCV antibody positivity rates, was consistent between the median income areas. And so what was the result of this? So the result was that the pharma company then was leveraging the study to direct their commercial efforts and their commercial targeting to drive additional business, right? So they refocused some of their reps into different geographies to identify and surface those additional opportunities. The next example that I want to talk about is how the lab data has been used to understand disease prevalence. And this study, the Quest team analyzed our data to present a revised estimate of the presence of hereditary xerocytosis in the United States. So using our data and based upon a study group of 48 million people, our team calculated the prevalence of HX to be about 1 in 7,000 adults, compared to the previously published estimate of 1 in 50,000 adults. So that new estimate is 7 times higher than the previous estimate, and identified that there's opportunity for further exploration of development of therapeutics for this particular condition. I've covered a couple of the use cases for which the Quest Diagnostics data alone has been extremely valuable, but we also enable use cases where Quest data can be linked to other kinds of data for analysis and analytics. And one of the partners that we use is Datavant. We have a great relationship with our Datavant partners, and I'm going to let Sue talk about some specific example of a project where Datavant enabled that project through a linked data set. Sue?
Thanks, Patrick. So Datavant's technology can enable de-identified patient-level record linkage across data types. What we do is our software creates encrypted tokens for each patient, and those tokens are irreversible back to the underlying PII elements from which they are made. The tokens therefore represent a de-identified patient, but since they're created from unique identifying elements for that patient, such as name, gender, date of birth, our tokens can be used to match that patient's records across different organizations that hold the patient's data. So recently, we worked with a leading medical device company to de-identify and tokenize the user data from their continuous glucose monitoring devices. We matched the tokens from the device company to tokens on Quest patients who had received an HbA1c lab test. We also matched this to de-identified claims data to create a patient cohort that now integrates data from all 3 data types, the Quest lab data, claims data, and the proprietary device user data from the manufacturer. What this enabled is it allows the manufacturer to track real-world outcomes for patients who use their device. The HbA1c lab values provide an indicator of diabetes control, and the claims data is being used to provide information on whether other comorbidities often associated with diabetes are also improved from use of this device. So now that we have talked through some ways that Quest data can be used to gain clinical insights, I'd like to pause here and collect some more feedback from the audience. Which of the following use cases are you most interested in for Quest data? Please take a moment to answer the poll question, and the results will show live for everyone. Okay, the results are in. It looks like 41% of respondents are interested in all of the use cases named above. So that's great to see. Thanks everyone for providing that feedback. So now I'll provide a quick overview of the process for working with Quest data. You can start by requesting a feasibility assessment of test counts, which Datavant can help facilitate. So this is a count on test volume, not volume of tests with a specific result range, since results are provided only upon licensing the data. During this feasibility stage, Quest's clinical team, the clinical franchises, as Patrick referred to, are available to help suggest relevant tests for the disease area or answer questions you may have about what the relevant tests are that you should be requesting a count on. If the test count meets the threshold required for your project, then we move into the next phase where Quest will set pricing, and the pricing is determined by a number of factors. Quest will consider the testing area, the volume of data available, as well as your use case. Once you accept the pricing proposal, then Datavant will handle contracting and data delivery to the licensor. So we've now covered some use cases and how to access the Quest data. I'll turn it now to the topic of COVID-19 testing. Dr. Kaufman, I know that Quest has put a ton of effort into increasing the capacity of testing available, as well as using the data to draw insights that improve public understanding of this pandemic. Can you share more about Quest's recent studies related to COVID-19?
Sure, Sue. As soon as someone mentions COVID-19, everyone sort of stops multitasking and focuses because we all want to learn more about it. And I've been very fortunate to be in a position to sort of dive into the Quest Diagnostics data. So as of the end of September, we reported more than 15 million molecular SARS-CoV-2 RNA nucleic acid amplification tests. PCR is a subset of the nucleic acid amplification test. And we reported more than 3.5 million serology, known as IgG antibody test results as of the end of September. We started molecular testing on March 9th, and we started the serology IgG antibody testing on April 20th. Quest Diagnostics is an innovative company, so we continually work hard to improve access to testing options and capabilities. Today, we can accommodate more than 200,000 molecular NAT tests per day. And our turnaround time is now 1 or 2 days in most cases. We've introduced, I think only a few days ago or last week, new panels that include both SARS-CoV-2 molecular test and influenza testing. And we're working, and maybe later this month, we'll introduce antigen testing. So what this timeline shows is the speed in which we are responding to this issue. And we didn't really know in March and April the scale of this issue. And as we moved into mid-April, we were doubling capacity about every 25 days. And by the end of June, as demand exploded, our capacity was greatly exceeded. But the good news is we've caught up. So next slide, please. So one of the bigger and most challenging achievements was the development of a self-collection kit. That was a challenge in terms of getting it through the FDA. And what this kit does, it delivers a kit that we can provide to an individual through FedEx, and then the individual ships it back through FedEx to the laboratory. So it eliminates the person's need to travel, particularly when they're ill. It eliminates the long lines. It's just a more efficient way to get tested. So on the next slide is a really cool innovation. So the process that I just mentioned relies on shipping a test kit by FedEx. So a couple of weeks ago, we rolled out this new collaboration with Walmart and Drone Up. So what Drone Up does is delivers the test kit, and this is limited to a pilot market north of Las Vegas, by drone. So instead of taking day or two to ship a kit, it's down to hours or less. That's kind of cool. It's where the world's moving. Next slide. So as Patrick tried, it's hard to sometimes discuss our footprint. And SARS-CoV-2 gave us an opportunity to do that. And so again, I'll mention the number that Patrick mentioned, which is that as of the end of, actually it was the beginning of July, within 4 months, we had patients in counties representing 99.9% of the US population. So we cover the US, and I'm sorry for Hawaii and Alaska, but we cover them too. And they're just not shown on the map. Next slide, please. So now I'm going to pivot to some of the studies. This is where I have a lot of fun. And we were fortunate to have a lot of these garner a lot of attention. So it's possible because of the scale of our testing. So in this case, Dr. Anthony Fauci was giving grand rounds at UPenn last week, and he featured our study and admonished those who were listening to get their patients to return for routine screening. And next slide. And the next slide is, this is one of our more powerful studies, and it shows the relationship between circulating levels of vitamin D and SARS-CoV-2 NAT positivity. The patients with deficient levels had twice the positivity rate of patients with higher levels. And the relationship held across major ethnic groups, across income groups, across population density. And I was just told yesterday that even President Trump was put on vitamin D supplements. The Quest Diagnostics data can be used to understand these patterns and evolving patterns of COVID-19 and the immune response and the relationship between COVID-19 and any medical condition. And the data can be used to improve clinical trial recruitment, as Patrick mentioned. The next slide, please. So there's a really important question, which is who develops an immune response and how long does it last? And will the immunity be transient or is it going to be long lasting? And different viruses act in different ways in terms of our bodies to those viruses. And based on studies on similar viruses, namely the coronaviruses SARS and MERS and other coronaviruses that are related to common cold and influenza A and B, it's very likely that our response to SARS-CoV-2 is going to be transient, meaning it's going to last months or a couple of years. Antibody responders are being recruited today to participate in clinical trials and as plasma donors. And we're actively working with a number of pharmaceutical companies, directly or indirectly through Datavant and other organizations that help support these efforts, and particularly with clinical trial recruitment. And then the next slide sort of gets to the same question. It's one of our most complex studies where we looked at the detectable antibody response. So indeed, detectable antibody response peaked at, as expected, at 15 to 28 days, but also wanes over time. And interestingly, the response became undetectable quickest for younger people under the age of 55, which is opposite of what we'd normally expect. So the likely reason for that is that younger people have milder disease and presumably start with lower levels of antibody in response to the infection. And older people had more severe disease and maintained that detectable response for a longer period of time. When we get a vaccine, which we hope is soon, it's likely to reverse in that people vaccinated will get the same dose, and older people are more likely to show waning of that response sooner. So that's a very quick overview. I turn it back to you, Sue.
Thanks, Dr. Kaufman. So that concludes our prepared content, and I'll open it up for Q&A at this time. To submit a question, you can use the icon at the bottom right of your Zoom window that's labeled Q&A to submit a question. Okay, so let's start with Patrick or Dr. Kaufman, can you talk about the tests you offer in high demand areas such as oncology?
Sure. So as Patrick mentioned, our test menu has over 4,000 tests. It is arguably the widest test menu of any laboratory in the country. We introduce 100 or more tests each year on test panels, trying to stay on top of advances in medicine. And as it relates specifically to oncology cancer, just keep in mind, there's about 1.7 million patients identified with newly diagnosed with cancer each year. In our JAMA paper that Dr. Fauci highlighted there, we talk about the percent of newly identified patients that are in the Quest Diagnostics database compared to the National Cancer Institute database, and we've got a healthy share. The other elements is that we have continued to expand our test menu. We've done a lot of acquisitions going back a number of years with Ameripath, where we, in essence, doubled the number of pathologists. We acquired Phenopath, MedFusion, Blueprint Genetics. They're all intended to help us better serve patients. One of those tests is the IBM Watson Genomics that was quickly on that side, one of the sides on that one of those slides, which provides personalized treatment that targets cancer cells containing specific mutations. We have LeukoVantage for patients with leukemia. It's a 42 gene panel with different panels. We offer a number of companion diagnostics. And then finally, just want to mention, we had a paper a month or so ago on cervical cancer, on the value of co-testing HPV and liquid-based cytology. And it had twice as many cervical cancer patients identified in the next largest study. It was a large national study spanning over 9 years. It just highlights, one, the scale, scope of our capabilities and our ability to translate that into something meaningful and impactful, and hopefully will help guide patient care.
Great, thank you. We have another question. What kind of information do you need from claims data to obtain the lab data for that population? I can go ahead and answer that one, and if Patrick or Dr. Kaufman want to provide additional info, please feel free to jump in. But this is the kind of activity that Datavant can help with. If you have a claims data set that you want to match certain lab data values to, that claims data set would need to have patient first name, last name, gender, and date of birth. Datavant software can create the encrypted tokens from that identifiable information. And then what we can do is use those tokens to match it to the Quest lab data to be able to provide the lab data linked to claims data.
So let me just jump in quickly. So one of the areas of expertise at Quest Diagnostics is understanding lab tests. That's what we do. And sometimes in some of these queries, there's some issues as to what is the right lab test, what are the right definitions, do we want to define, limit in terms of age or sex or other parameters, and we are always very open to have those dialogues with you to better understand how to define the right lab test in the right population to answer the questions.
That's a great point. Thank you for adding that. Another question is, does Quest have access to global lab data?
I'll take that one too. Yeah, I'll start. So Quest has formed an organization or a collaborative relationship, a strategic working group called the Quest Diagnostics Global Network. So the Global Diagnostic Network, sorry. And that GDN, it represents 10 of the world's largest leading diagnostic companies. And the goal and the objectives for that network is to enhance diagnostic insights around the globe. So also part of that stated goal is to gain access to integrated data and analysis. So it's a project and an initiative that we're actively working on, but the data from the GDN is expected to become available from different countries over the course of next year. Quest Diagnostics itself does have some laboratories outside of the US, but everything that we've talked about today, the analyses that we've done, the counts on the lab data, are US-based counts. And then of course we'll continue to keep our partners like Datavant and our own materials up to date with regards to the availability of international data.
Thanks, Patrick. Another question comes from someone who works at a company that has delivered over 2.5 million COVID-19 test results across the US from various labs, excluding Quest and LabCorp. How should we think about incorporating those data into this data set? We'd like to help with efforts to show a more complete picture of what's happening with COVID-19.
Yeah, I think that, so generally we work within Quest, we work with our data, and then we work with partners like Datavant if someone has an opportunity to work with multiple sources of data. But I think that it's a great point that there's a lot of testing distributed through different organizations. Of course, we've shared the counts that we have. We've performed a significant amount, but to look at that global picture and be able to pull and integrate some of that and present that certainly is valuable information. So I don't have a direct answer for how to do that, but I think if you have some ideas where you might want to present that integrated data, I think in collaboration, maybe reaching out to the Datavant team, they can broker some introduction and some conversation, and we can see what opportunities there would be to do that.
Yeah, one of the advantages of working with Datavant is, in this particular case, is the ability for Datavant to deduplicate patients so that patients who are served in multiple laboratories aren't counted multiple times. And one can get a sort of better view as to what's going on.
Great, thank you. Another question, how do you think about prioritizing the development of new tests? Are there specific areas of focus you expect to launch testing in the near future?
So priority one at the moment is anything related to COVID-19 for obvious reasons. But every year we go through a rigorous process to identify what are the new tests that we need to really work on. Some of it is driven strictly by financials as to tests that we're sending out that we should now bring in. But we have physicians who are going to conferences of virtually every specialty trying to identify what are the new tests, and we have academic associates who also basically are combing the conferences and literature to identify opportunities. So it's a process we've been following for many, many decades and very effective at providing the most current test to serve patients.
Okay, thank you. Another question is, what is the format of the data when we get it from Quest?
Yeah, I'll take that one. So we have an established kind of data layout between for Quest to Datavant through the Datavant engine. So I can talk a little bit about the data elements, right? But that kind of the technical format. I think you could collaborate with your contact at Datavant to see what that format, that specific format looks like and how it's delivered to you. But we include basic data elements or HIPAA permitted data elements right around the patient. There's a group of data points around the ordering provider. And then a set of data elements specific to the test and the result. So the test name, the link code, the result values, the normal or abnormal, the reference range, those items related to the test. So some of that structure then is dependent upon the type of test that it is. Some lab tests have discrete result values, right? So most of us probably have been and had a cholesterol test, and we know that our total cholesterol is X number, right? Or if you've had an A1C result, you know that your number is X. But some other testing has an interpretive component to it, or a qualitative component to it. Let's make sure I'm not mixing up my words there. A qualitative component where there is some interpretation that might be in a comment, right, where the interpreting provider has some narrative around that particular test, and that piece of data then those comments and then are first scrubbed and looked to make sure there's no PHI in them, and then that comment itself is provided as well. And as we continue to work towards pulling out some of the structured data, to make it even more streamlined to work with. But some of that, the answer to that question there's a defined set for a good portion of the result data. And then the result itself varies a little bit depending on if it's a qualitative or a quantitative result.
Yeah,
Dr.
one
Kaufman
other
or Harvey, anything
element.
you'd like to add to
Yeah,
that?
yeah. So one other element is there's an enterprise ID, which is then tokenized so that one can track patients over time. So that's, if you look at some of the studies that I presented and use cases, the ability to link information over time is critical. And understanding past diagnoses and trends of results is helpful.
Great, really helpful. Thank you both. All right, those are all the questions that we've gotten. We can conclude here. Thank you everyone for joining today. Thank you to our guests, Patrick and Dr. Kaufman from Quest, for sharing your insights. We'll be making this webinar recording available next week, and we'll send out an email once it's up. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.